this is Fabio Ferrax. It's been a while since I've made a video on here, but I'm very happy to see that my Lucio Fulci video has done all right. It's had a few thousand views, and so I wanted to make another one. So over the course of the last week, I've been compiling a list, and the more I thought about it, the more in depth it grew. I wanted to do a top 10 list of my favorite zombie films of all time, and I realized squeezing all of them into a top 10 was too difficult, so I extended it to the top 15, and it's something that I feel like 15 entries is enough to kind of give you a better scope of the genre as I go through this list in reverse order. Hopefully it will be as entertaining as my Fulci top 10. But and we'll see if Fulci plays a role at all here. I think you can guess at one of the entries. But nonetheless, the more I thought about it, the more I realized I had to come up with what were my criteria here. Are we talking about just the plain best zombie films ever made? Or are we talking about, are there certain elements of zombie films that weigh more heavy than others? And I think that's true. You'll find my list to not have many modern entries in them. But I suppose I can talk more about that at the end. So I'll take a drink of water here. And it's been a lot of fun putting this together, I'll just say. I've always enjoyed being able to look back on time and determine determining the order of value of certain things. So let me just go ahead and jump right into number 15. Island of the Living Dead. Now this is directed by Bruno Mattei, the notorious Italian director. And he also directed this as Vincent Dawn. And this film is actually one of my more modern entries in this list of 15. It came out in 2006, although IMDb says 2007. The disc I own says 2006, and a lot of things that I've seen say 2006. Let me say something about this film. Island of the Living Dead. Here we have Bruno Mattei, a guy who is directing zombie films, kind of up and coming in the 80s. And here he is in the 2000s, back in the genre, right? Now, this is the first of, I think, what was planned. I've heard this several places, but that Mattei had planned to make a trilogy, but he only ended up making 2, and he actually unfortunately passed away before a third could be made. He went back to the Philippines to make these, a place where he had made zombie films throughout the 80s with Claudio Fragasso and Lucio Fulci. It is interesting that he directed this film as Vincent Dawn. Now, obviously, his name is probably big enough, that is, Bruno Mattei's name is probably big enough that he didn't have to do this. But we know that this is nostalgia. This is love of a genre, right? And he went back to it. And the fact that he went back to the place where he had filmed previous movies. Now, this series actually starts out with Island of the Living Dead. And I believe it is much superior to the sequel, which is called Zombies: The Beginning. Now, Zombies: The Beginning didn't make this list, and it's basically, they took the entire plot of Aliens, that is the sequel to Alien. They took the entire plot of that and adjusted the dialogue and the setting for a zombie flick, and it While it might be funny to watch, it follows virtually line for line Alien. Um, but this movie, the first of this trilogy, Island of the Living Dead, is actually its own story, and it's pretty entertaining. It does have a lot of the unfortunate trappings of modern films, where you don't have that sense of nostalgia anymore. You don't have that atmosphere. But nonetheless, it stars a Philippine actress named Yvette Izan, and she's a cutie. I like her in this role as kind of I guess a counterpart to or a kind of a continuation of the Sigourney Weaver and Alien kind of I guess feminist protagonist. I shouldn't say that dreaded word feminist, but female protagonist, and she also stars in the sequel, Zombies: The Beginning. So I'd assume she would have starred in the third movie had it been made. I wonder, could Claudio Fragasso emerge to complete the trilogy? Who knows? Fragasso was the last of the surviving Italian masters of the various genres coming out of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I look forward to any work that he has left to do. But this was a Bruno Mattei film and one of his last, Island of the Living Dead. Now let me move on to number 14. Let me just check and make sure this is still recording. Okay, good. Back to my notes. Okay, number 14. Zombie Holocaust. Yeah, this is... I kind of had high expectations going into this because this is a movie I hadn't seen until recently, and I was able to get it. It's collected in the Zombie Pack 2. And if you don't know the Zombie Packs, here in the United States at least, they have 2 collections of 3 films each, Zombie Pack and Zombie Pack 2. This is in Zombie Pack 2. And it was kind of disappointing, although it did come out in 1980s, directed by Marino Girolami. And it had another name, Dr. Butcher, M.D., which is really funny because if you look at the movie posters, like, what is this other movie? But that's just the alternate title. The main title was Zombie Holocaust, but at some point it must have been some other country. It was also called Dr. Butcher, M.D. It's an odd crossover, really, between the cannibal and zombie genres. I don't really remember... It doesn't really stand out much beyond that. There are some interesting scenes. There's some island hopping and, the search for the origins of things, and I always find that fascinating. But nonetheless, I was disappointed with this film because my expectations were so high. But it makes the top 15 because, it came out in that frenzy of movies in the early 80s. It came out in 1980, and so it has the vintage appeal, and just the crossover aspects of it put it in my top 15, Zombie Holocaust. So I go on to number 13, Hell of the Living Dead. Now, I had trouble finding a copy of this movie on its own. I actually ended up getting it in a 2-pack of I believe Bruno Mattei and Claudio Fragasso movies, Hell of the Living Dead and Rats. It was put out by Shout Factory here in the US, so I have a nice Blu-ray of it. Hell of the Living Dead, directed by Bruno Mattei, also came out in 1980. So like I said, there's just a slew of movies that came out. Now, in 1980, This film might have been filmed in Papua New Guinea. It says that they went to Papua New Guinea, so there's no point to... I'd have to do more research in it, but I assume they actually filmed this in Papua, and which is a very exotic place these days, let alone in 1980. And it's an Italian film, so you have these Italian actors. It's pretty interesting. It also seems like it teased that it might be involved some of the cannibal genre, because as we know, Papua New Guinea is one of the last places to practice cannibalism. But it is a zombie flick, and it's international. So we see that Claudio Fragasso was unaccredited, I believe, for this. But as we know in the hierarchy of Italian cinema, Bruno Mattei was the master and Claudio Fragasso was the young assistant, right? So it is a Bruno Mattei film. It also had an alternative title, Night of the Zombies. This movie, it definitely has vintage appeal. It's definitely campy, and so it has all those aspects going for it. It's creepy at times. But overall, I felt a little bit disappointed by the story, so that's why it doesn't rank higher. But nonetheless, 1980, this is pretty early for Bruno Mattei and Claudio Fragasso. This might be their first zombie film. I'd have to check on that, but I think it is. So let's move to number 12. Oasis of the Zombies. Now, this film, I always love the old vintage movie poster of this. You can actually order a small print of this on, I believe it's fullmoondirect.com, because I always love the old movie poster of this film. Oasis of the Zombies was directed by Jess Franco in 1982. Once again, you got that little sweet spot right around the change of the decade, 1982. And I believe that's what separates Gen X from millennials, by the way. If you're born in 82, maybe it's 83, but 82, I think you're actually considered a millennial. Anyway, Jess Franco, I don't know much about him, and that's probably a good thing because apparently he directed a lot of like softcore pornography kind of movies and sexploitation films and stuff, but he did delve into these other genres like the zombie genre. And Oasis of the Zombies, for a while I had it in my top 10, and that's not only because of the foreign campy vintage appeal of it, but also because I don't know, there's something interesting about an oasis that has zombies in it. You know, it has the typical, I think it was Nazis. It's always Nazis, right? That have become zombies and are guarding treasure or something. It's been a while since I've seen it. Kino Lorber has put out a Blu-ray of it as part of the Redemption collection, which I own, of course. And it's an interesting film. I think what makes this one interesting is the zombie action is pretty bad. It's not, it's pretty low quality action, but the scenery is pretty interesting because it kind of combines Europe and Africa, in that you have these Europeans traveling to these Oriental locations, or I guess not, if it's Africa, it's not Oriental, but traveling to these locations that are foreign to them, and throw zombies in the mix, and you have kind of an interesting story. I remember being interested by the story in this, which is why it ranks as highly as it does. It's worth checking out. Just don't expect a lot. When it comes to combat, don't expect a lot. Okay, let me move on to number 11. Number 11, I have Zombie 4, After Death. Now, this was the first film, I'm assuming, or at least the first of the zombie films, where Claudio Fragasso finally got out from under the shadow of Lucio Fulci and Bruno Mattei, and he directed this film himself and wrote the film himself, or possibly with his wife. I know they do a lot of stuff. They do a lot of projects together. So it was filmed in 1989, but it really seems earlier than that. It does kind of seem like the 80s, but because it's so low quality, it seems like early 80s or late 70s or something. Acting's really bad, story's pretty bad, but it has all the campiness that I've come to love. If you don't love the campiness, if you don't love just the simplicity, in a way, of the zombie genre, then, most of these films are not going to be for you. Well, what's strange about Zombie 4 After Death is that, for some reason, the main protagonist is, I guess, a guy who at the time was a big male porn star, like a gay male porn star or whatever. What was his name? Stryker or something like that. I don't know. He's even in the special features. Now, this film was collected in the first of the zombie packs put out by Severn Films, like I had mentioned to you. Oh, and I should mention this too. Severn is about, at the time of this recording, Severn's about to put out special Blu-ray editions of Zombie 3 and Zombie 4, along with collector's pins of Bruno Mattei and Claudio Fragasso, and reprints of the movie posters. So that's something to look for from Severn Films. But yeah, Zombie 4 After Death, I hated it when I first saw it. I was disappointed by Zombie 3, and then I saw Zombie 4, and I was just... I didn't know what to think. I was just like, the quality seemed to be, jumping off a cliff or something. But now I love it. It's like you come back to it. You come back to the campiness, and you're like, yes, this is an interesting film. And part of what made this interesting was not only the location. I'm trying to think where this could be. It seemed like some kind of tropical location. It could have been the Philippines. Most likely was. Especially given that they were filming there the year before for Zombie 3. But Zombie 4, I think part of what makes it interesting is the opening scene, which is kind of terrifying. And at the end of the film, they come back to that opening scene, or the location of that opening scene, without giving too much away. Okay, let's move on to number 10. It's finally in the top 10 here. Let me just make sure I'm still recording. Good. Okay, number 10, Zombie Lake, directed by Jean Rollin in 1981. So I almost thought this was another Jess Franco film, because the two seem to share a lot of that. First of all, they shared a lot of the actors, I think. I could be wrong. But it seemed like they both seemed like not Italian films, like French films. And this is also put out by Kino Lorber. It's, I think this is number 20 in their Redemption series, and Oasis of the Zombies is number 21. So this is also on Blu-ray. Zombie Lake, I actually just watched today. This is the only one that I had it. I hadn't gotten around to it. I know I'd seen a few minutes of it, and I like the ambiance of it. The opening scene is beautiful. It's there's a lot of naked girls in the movie, but it's all done rather tastefully, or rather, even if you don't consider it tasteful, I would say it's, what's the term for it? It's almost like if someone was going to paint a picture of the Garden of the Hesperides or something, or someone's painting something where there's a bunch of nymphs sitting around the water, because once again, this all takes place around this haunted lake. And so there's always these beautiful young naked women around the lake, swimming in the lake. And obviously, given the name of the film, that's a bad idea. And the little village, a little town that the lake sits next to is absolutely beautiful. Beautiful scenery. And the thing that really grabbed me, and the only reason why this ranks as highly as it does, is I really felt that the romance, the unspoken romance, when I say unspoken, it was because it was between a French townswoman and a German soldier. And so they didn't share the language in common, but the relationship was, it was beautiful. It was tragic but beautiful. And it's kind of like a haunting aspect of the story. Even though you could say this is low budget garbage from the early 80s, sure, but it has its own elements of beauty in it, and I think it's something really special. You know, at one point, the mayor is welcoming in a reporter, and he invites her into his study. And during this one scene, you can see, for some reason, the mayor, it's like kind of an old study that has all these old tables and books and stuff, but for some reason there's all this wiring set up, and that's obviously for like the cameras, and like he walks past it, and then you also see in the mirror behind him, you see the cameramen following them into the study. So there are little things like that. I don't mind it. It kind of just, it shows you what it was like to make a movie during that time. 1981, once again, that little sweet spot for this genre. So that's Zombie Lake. I do recommend it, although it's a bit slow and the action's a bit lame for most zombie films, but I think it makes up for it, and it's just gorgeous settings. Okay, let's move on to number 9. Burial Ground, The Nights of Terror, directed by Andrea Bianchi, 1981, same year as Zombie Lake. First, let me get this out of the way. This features the beautiful Mariangela Giordano. She's one of the most beautiful actresses I've ever seen. She, Italian. She was in what's currently one of my favorite spaghetti westerns, Una lunga fila de croci, which was retitled in English Hanging for Django, and also No Room to Die. She is in this film as well. So I found that really interesting that she's in 2 of these films that I watched from these different genres. And Burial Ground, it has all the elements of the previous films. You know, it has the campiness, it has just the eeriness and the atmosphere of those films, those foreign films from the early 80s. And I say foreign from the United States perspective, obviously. But that it really adds atmosphere. It's really thick. A lot of crazy stuff goes on in this movie. This is where the zombie action starts to get good. Just a lot of really weird stuff, especially, and probably the most comic thing about this film and how it's most referred to, or what it's most referred to for, is this absurd kind of mother and son dynamic between 2 of the characters. I'm not going to spoil it for anyone, but you'll definitely notice it. What's weird about it is I think there's kind of a little bit, they're a little bit too intimate. But the son's supposed to look really young, but I think he's played by like an actor that's actually much older, that has some kind of like medical condition where he looks younger. So it's a really bizarre. The movie's really bizarre. Check it out. It's awesome. This is in Zombie Pack 2 along with Zombie Holocaust. So that pack's pretty good. And Burial Ground, The Nights of Terror. You gotta see it to believe it. And it's really not a bad zombie movie. It's not. It's a good one. Okay, number 8. Day of the Dead. George A. Romero, 1985. I really have been trying to stay away from the mainstream so far in this list, but I will have to dip into it for a while from time to time, because to really understand the genre, you have to understand the origins. You have to understand where the stuff is coming from, what started it all, what started the craze. And George A. Romero's zombie movies are what started it. Sure, there were zombie movies before, but they didn't define the genre. They basically just acknowledge that there's some kind of monster, a type of monster called a zombie. There's also mummies, there's also skeletons, there's vampires, werewolves, blah, blah, blah. But until George A. Romero kind of really brought the zombie genre to the forefront, it didn't exist. So he wanted to direct a zombie film once every decade. So he started out in the late 60s with Night of the Living Dead, and then he did Dawn of the Dead in the 70s, and here we have in the 80s Day of the Dead. Now, after seeing his previous films, Day of the Dead, I don't think it really added much to Dawn of the Dead. The thing I liked best about Day of the Dead, two things. One, it also had an awesome setting. People hiding out in kind of like a mine or some kind of... It's been a long time since I've seen this, but I remember it pretty well because this is one of those movies I grew up on. As a teenager, I saw this. I'd finally gotten over, when I was 10 or something, I've finally gotten over my fear of scary movies. I couldn't watch them before then. And the zombie genre just sucked me right in. And so I remember when I saw Day of the Dead, it was really creepy setting. It's post-apocalypse. These people are trying to figure out how to move forward, what to do next. They're held up in this kind of like underground station, government station. So really awesome setting. I think what I liked most about this film was just that the apocalypse had already happened. And we're kind of in the late stages here. They're trying to figure out what to do. And it's pretty creepy stuff. Good stuff. I'll have to see that again because I haven't seen it in a long time, and now that my appreciation for the genre has grown since my teenage years, I definitely want to check that out again. Okay, so I'm going on to number 7, Zombie 3. Now, Zombie 3, where you get that number from is the first zombie movie is, according to this series, it doesn't really make any sense. The first movie, according to this series, the titles was Dawn of the Dead, and then Zombie 2 by Lucio Fulci. And here we have Zombie 3. This was filmed in the Philippines in 1988. And there's something special about this movie, I think. First of all, I remember being disappointed when I saw it, but that's because I wasn't accustomed to watching foreign zombie films. I'd been used to American standards, and I wasn't used to the campiness or the low quality. But once again, when you film with those older type of cameras or whatever kind they were using, it really kind of adds a graininess. It makes the film very enjoyable for me now. So, one of the things that really special about this, other than the awesome soundtrack, and I think it was Fabio Frizzi, probably was, just awesome soundtrack blasting throughout the movie. Once again, I talked about this during my Lucio Fulci top 10. Lucio Fulci went to the Philippines to direct this, got very sick, I think about halfway through or something, or maybe a third of the way through. But he's in good company, because Bruno Mattei, the up-and-coming Italian genre master. I don't want to say gore master because, Lucio Fulci is considered the godfather of gore. Bruno Mattei kind of the same, following the same footsteps. And they also had with them Claudio Fragasso, the young Claudio Fragasso, who is the writer. So 3 of these guys were able to work on this film. Once again, Severin will be putting out a Blu-ray version of this with CD soundtrack, with Mattei and Claudio Fragasso pens, with the poster for this one looks pretty awesome. So I kind of want to get a copy of that. Once again, 1988. It stars the two kind of... for some reason, these guys are always... It's like they're bros, right? And they are always in films together. They tend to do action scenes and stuff. Ottaviano Dell'Acqua, whose American screen name is Richard Raymond, and also Massimo Vanni, whose American screen name is Alex McBride. And also, while we're talking about screen names, Claudio Fragasso, he went by the name of Clyde Anderson, and Bruno Mattei went by the name of Vincent Dawn. I'm not sure if all of them are in the titles, but I think they are. Anyway, so you got this is kind of a real core group of this 1980s Italian film crew. A real nice clique you got going on in this film. It's an entertaining film, entertaining story. The scenes are great. There are some funny mess ups, like at one point, like they're running through the streets from the zombies, and you look up in one of these windows, and there's like a little girl just looking out the window, like watching the people film the movie. It's filmed in the Philippines, so you'll see that. Good one. This is a good one. All right, let's move on to number 6. Return of the Living Dead 3, directed by Brian Yuzna in 1993. Let me say really quickly about the director, Brian Yuzna. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right or whatever. He directed and worked on a bunch of projects, many of which were related to Lovecraft. He did 2 sequels to the film Reanimator, Bride of the Reanimator and Beyond Reanimator. He also did Necronomicon, From Beyond, Dagon, and he also was involved in the 1980s horror film called Dolls, which is kind of like a precursor to the Puppet Master franchise, and actually one of the dolls recurs throughout several of these films. Anyway, Return of the Living Dead 3. There are a few films, there's only a few zombie films that really cemented the genre in my mind, and this was one of them. I remember going to a friend's place, and this was in the early 90s. Once again, this film came out in 1993. And his parents had all these awesome TV setups and stuff, and had like access to all these cable channels with movies, and this movie was coming on. And the opening scene of Return of the Living Dead just chilled me to the bone. Like, I hadn't seen stuff like this in films. Now, by today's standards, it's probably pretty tame, but it freaked me out, and I was just on the edge of my seat watching this with my friend. The gore is, as far as the 90s goes, pushed to the max, and it's a pretty disturbing film. I still love the early 90s you kind of also get the vibe of the early 90s when you have the son and the son's girlfriend, and they're hanging out on the cliff coasts of California, trying to find something interesting to do, and unfortunately they do. It doesn't really fit nicely into the 80s, the 70s, 80s zombie genre, but it's strong enough to stand on its own, and this was a big one for me, appreciating the genre. Definitely watch it. Return of the Living Dead 3. Let me take a little drink of water here. Make sure we're still recording. Yeah. 33 minutes. I knew this was going to take a while. Okay. Number 5. We're in the top 5. This is one I hadn't seen until a year or two ago. I own it now on Blu-ray from Raro Video. Number 5 is Nightmare City, directed by Umberto Lenzi in 1980. Yeah, Nightmare City. Umberto Lenzi, first of all, he's one of these Italian gore directors, along with Mattei and Fulci and some others, and he was probably best known for his contributions to the cannibal genre, a genre which while I think it has merits, I find it so hard to watch that I can't really appreciate it as well as the zombie genre. But he's really known for its Cannibal Ferox and Eaten Alive, which is not to be confused with a film by the same name, Eaten Alive, by Toby Hooper, which is really good. Umberto Lenzi was one of the last living of these gore masters. He passed away in 2017. It's kind of sad. It's just, and it's only Claudio Fragasso. He's the one, to finish all of this work. So I really have high hopes for him. So let me talk a bit about the film, Nightmare City. Once again, 1980. Like, the time, the setting, it's just one of those, it's just period piece. People are still wearing those weird, like, disco-era suits and stuff. It's an Italian film through and through. Awesome, awesome film. And without giving too much away, because it's just in the beginning, this plane arrives, and it's carrying something, right? And the people don't know how to react. Like, the government's trying to react, and it's a great zombie flick. Very entertaining. I'm trying to remember back to it. It's just, I really enjoyed it. I didn't have high expectations because I figured that any that I hadn't seen up until that point, because it was only a couple of years ago, they must not be that good. But this one was really good. Definitely check this out. It's an interesting film. You can probably see it for free online, I think. Some people have been posting it and stuff. Very entertaining zombie flick. Campy, vintage, great zombie action. Creepy, good stuff. And it's, it kind of has the foreign film appeal for us here in the United States. Let's go on to number 4. So I will jump back into the mainstream here and say that number 4 is Night of the Living Dead, but not the original, the remake. Some might think this is blasphemy. You could put the original in here too. I mean, really, they're the same film. They really, when they remade it, they remade it. I just happen to enjoy the 1990 version a little bit more. It's a little more smooth. The action's a little more intense. It's just more polished. And there's color. And, Tony Todd does a great job playing the role of Ben. We know him, of course, from the Candyman series. The actor, that is, from the Candyman series. It's directed by Tom Savini. Don't know much about him. This came out in 1990. Now, the original Night of the Living Dead came out in what? Was it 1968 or something? But this one was really good. Both of them were good. It's just recently I tried to watch Night of the Living Dead, and it was really slow, and I could tell like the people I was watching it with weren't really into it. So I think that maybe the modern remake would have kept their attention more. I really enjoyed this. This, if you need a starting point for the zombie genre, I'd recommend this or the original, but I would recommend this because it flows better with some of the others. Even though it's in the 90s, you're right between the 80s and 90s, so it seems more like a 90s film than it does an 80s film, for sure, but it's pretty good. It did not disappoint me. And besides, you need to have your base, right? You need to know where all this stuff is coming from, where all the movie lore at least is, and so you can watch Night of the Living Dead at number 4. Okay, on to the top 3. Number 3, Return of the Living Dead. Directed by Dan O'Bannon in 1985. Really quickly about Dan O'Bannon, it seems like he's just worked on so many interesting things. He worked on, Dark Star in the 70s, and then he was writing something that eventually became 1979's Alien, which was directed by Ridley Scott, but O'Bannon was the writer for it. And he also wrote, 1990's Total Recall. So, I mean, this guy has kind of a magic touch. He didn't actually do much direction in his career. He was mostly a writer, but the things he did were gold. So this is one of them. 1985's Return of the Living Dead. Now, recently, in the last 10 years, this has kind of become a real cliche cult classic. But before then, I remember watching this in the 90s, and a lot of us kids then, like I was in my teens, we hadn't heard of any of this stuff. This was from the 80s. And just the punk elements of this are just, not only are they hilarious, but they're pretty cool. I mean, you get to really kind of see. First of all, the soundtrack is fantastic. I owned the soundtrack for a while, listened to it all the time. Someone ended up stealing it from me. It's that good. So yeah, someone stole the soundtrack of this from me. That's how good it is. Punk soundtrack through and through. The Cramps, I'm not really familiar with a lot of these bands. I think the Damned, it's so good. And I'm not someone who generally likes punk music, but it is really interesting. Great survival horror elements. The comedic acting is fantastic. Like, both the young and old actors, but especially the older actors, are actually really entertaining in this. Like, the Mortician is just hilarious. He's like a survivalist. Like, I think he's a Nazi sympathizer too. If you look, like, he's like listening to all this. Like, he has like a German style pistol that he pulls out, and he has like Nazi stuff hanging on the wall. I don't know. It's just kind of like these weird. There's all these weird elements in this movie, especially the punk rockers, and I don't know. It's one of these things where you're stuck in a setting, kind of like Night of the Living Dead, and you're trapped in by the zombies, and it has the 80s elements. Very good. The Return of the Living Dead 1 and 3 are the only good Return of the Living Dead movies, in my opinion, even though there's 5 or 6 of them out now. But yeah, great film. I don't need to say much about this because I feel like everyone will have known what this is by now. Shout Factory did all this new cover art. They actually released 2 unique posters with unique artwork, which some people are scalping on eBay. I have the Shout Factory. I have the Shout Factory Blu-ray, which has a lot of special features and stuff. But one of the weird things I'll have to say about the special features is, I guess when they came out the soundtrack for this, they released it on vinyl, and there's like a special edition of one of these vinyls where you turn it over and it's like the punk rock girl topless, like on the entire record, right? It's just so weird that you could actually play that. So once again, it's not like you have a black record with a little drawing in the center. No, it's the entire record is this like topless punk girl. I don't know. That's one of the guys on the special features show that. It's a really entertaining. It's almost like more comedy. But I remember when I was young, I was still kind of afraid of this stuff, and it was scary too. So if you're one of these people that still gets scared by movies and stuff, yeah, that's still kind of scary, but it's also, maybe it scares you at first, but it has replay value because it becomes a comedy as you watch it later in life, right? Like, I watch this as a comedy now. So a little bit of magic from Dan O'Bannon. Let's move on to number 2. Now, number 2 is Lucio Fulci's Zombie. And if I remember correctly, I think I also put Zombie 2 as Lucio Fulci's, as number 2 on my Lucio Fulci top 10. But I'm listing it here as Zombie 2 because that was the original title. Once again, they view it as a sequel to Dawn of the Dead by George A. Romero. But Zombie 2, Lucio Fulci, the godfather of gore. One of the best Italian directors. Sometimes this has been abbreviated to zombie, but this came out in 1979. The atmosphere is thick. It's palpable. It's in your face. The main actors are really good. The zombies look good and are creepy. They're kind of slow and the action is a bit limited, but other than that, like the Fabio Frizzi soundtrack is just so creepy and the settings are great. It's another one of these ones where you go from the west, like a western metropolis to, a remote island, and just awesome settings, awesome theme. This one ranks so highly because of its artistry, because of its theme, not so much because of story or action, but just the atmosphere. This is one of the thickest films in regard to atmosphere. Fulci was a master at thickening atmosphere around this time, around the turn of the decade, from the 70s to 80s. Once again, if you want to see more of this kind of atmosphere, watch his films, The Beyond and City of the Living Dead, which actually isn't a zombie film, ironically. It could be interpreted as one, but I won't put it on here. But yeah, Zombie 2, absolute classic. You all know it. If you don't know it, I don't mean to hype it up, because you do have to watch this in perspective. You do have to realize that, hey, this isn't going to be a 2018 high budget, in your face, Walking Dead, Brad Pitt movie or something, right? This is pure vintage zombie action here. Lucio Fulci, rest in peace. Fulci lives, right? Okay, let's go on to number one. Now, I'm really sorry for going mainstream here. I really am. I could have easily not gone mainstream, but I wouldn't have been true to the the theme of this list. Number one, the original Dawn of the Dead, directed by George A. Romero in 1978. You all know it. You've all seen it. If you haven't seen it, well then, you probably haven't seen any of these, so, get watching. But, so now that I've pointed this out as my number one, let me just say that I haven't put any of the newer ones, and I haven't put, 28 Days Later or whatever, or the remake of Dawn of the Dead, or World War Z, or Quarantine, which Quarantine is really good, I have to say. I didn't put any of those in because they just don't have the magic. They're scary, and that's great. They're scary and entertaining. Great, wonderful. This list is more about origins, is more about themes, and atmosphere. And Dawn of the Dead, the original, had all of those. I had seen Night of the Living Dead, and that was great. That was the people trapped in a house, boarding up the windows, zombies outside, survival, great. But Dawn of the Dead, much like Day of the Dead, but in a more impressive way, Dawn of the Dead asks the question, what do you do after the zombie apocalypse, or during it? Just really disenchanted people escaping the city. They just want to leave the chaos, right? And that's the most bizarre setting at the time, a mall. That's where they decide to make their stand. And great acting. There are bits of comedy, but it's really dark comedy, because it's comedy amid just the most hellish of circumstances. And it has everything. Even has roving biker gangs and every bit of survival horror. Because it's from the 70s, it has the vintage appeal. The vintage zombies add atmosphere. So even though I tend to prefer the foreign films, Romero did it best here. first, 1978. Once again, Zombie 2 was called Zombie 2 because it was a sequel to this, a sequel to the success of this film. This was a classic. I'm trying to think what else to say about it. I mean, when I was young and getting into the genre, this was the film that cemented it most for me. I'd say this, Night of the Living... Dawn of the Dead, the original, this one, Return of the Living Dead 3, and Day of the Dead really kind of sculpted the zombie genre in my eyes. It showed you the different directions you could go in that weren't just straight up, board up the windows, zombies are outside. It's just a fantastic film. It's a classic. There's really not much more I can say about it. Has all the elements of all the films previous, except for modernity, which may appear in some, like Island of the Living Dead. There's also, a message of hope. I do think that George A. Romero, I think that he probably injected politics into a lot of his films, which is, not always great, but anyway, you can ignore it if you want, or you can embrace it if you want, but I don't really remember anything too political about this. I do remember, there's elements of hope. To keep fighting, live another day. There's elements of those sentiments in this film, and I just really look forward to watching it again. It's been a while, but and believe me, I didn't want to put this one at number one. I wanted to put something really esoteric, really that no one knows about and stuff, but this is my number one. Now let me just say something about the list now that I've gone through it. What drove me to make this list the way I did was a combination of elements. Like I was choosing these movies based on atmosphere, based on importance, time setting. I'm getting to the point where if things aren't vintage, I don't like them anymore, because I remember films from these periods as being just better, more entertaining, more authentic, more alive, more believable. And I know zombie films aren't very believable, but they capture your imagination more than what I see coming out today. And so that's why so many of these films are older in my list. I should also say that I have yet to see, there was I believe he's a Spanish director who directed a quartet of zombie films. I know the third one's called Night of the Seagulls or something. I have not seen those, so if those are really good, then I'm sure some of those would have made this list. But so I've not seen everything. If there's any zombie movies you'd recommend, by all means, leave them in the comments. I did see, what is that film? There is another one of these. I think it's a British film, a zombie film. I saw where there's this weird mod guy going out to the countryside and there's zombies going. I was thinking about putting that in this list, but I can't fit everything in, and honestly, I didn't like it that much, so I can't remember what that film was. Something about sleeping, something. But, I don't know, this list is, I'm satisfied with this. There's a lot of... It took me a long time to see these movies, to collect these movies, to even find out about these movies, so... I'm sure a lot of you zombie fanatics out there will know all of this stuff already, but a lot of you won't. There's probably a lot of films in this list that you're like, I didn't even know about that. So hopefully this will give you a little more information and maybe let you know some fun films to watch, because Lord knows there's not that many good films coming out these days. So sometimes you got to delve into the past to find quality entertainment. Now, the zombie genre, it's kind of silly to call it art, but it's getting to the point where you'd almost call it art. It is its own genre, after all. But I've been going on for a while, so hopefully this talk was good, and thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll catch you later.